In the vast Zephyrian Empire, where crystalline cities float among purple nebulae and starships bend reality itself, there exists one universal truth that even the most advanced alien civilizations cannot escape: nobody knows how to handle a crying baby. When the Emperor's rare astral dragons, creatures born once every 1,000 years with the power to reshape space and time, began dying one by one under the care of the galaxy's most brilliant minds, the Imperial Court faced their greatest crisis. These weren't just pets or symbols of power. These dragon hatchlings were living weapons whose emotional states could tear holes in reality itself. Every alien expert had failed. The crystalline healers of Vega Prime, masters of life energy, watched helplessly as the baby dragons rejected their touch. The mind weavers of the Andromeda Collective, who could soothe the savage thoughts of entire worlds, found their telepathic abilities useless against the chaotic minds of infant dragons. Even the legendary beast whisperers of the Outer Rim, who had tamed black holes and taught supernovas to sing, admitted defeat. That's when someone made the most desperate decision in Imperial history. They called for help from the humans, a species so young that most aliens still thought they were a myth, so primitive that they hadn't even figured out faster than light travel, so backward that they still used something called medicine instead of proper energy healing. What the Empire didn't know was that humans had spent millions of years perfecting one skill that no other species in the galaxy possessed: keeping impossibly difficult babies alive against all odds. And, sometimes, the most advanced problems require the most basic solutions. This is the story of how a single human nurse armed with nothing but common sense, infinite patience, and a few tricks learned in Earth's toughest hospitals did what the greatest minds in the galaxy couldn't, and, in doing so, changed the course of interstellar history forever. The Imperial Nursery was supposed to be the most peaceful place in the Zephyrian Empire. Located in the heart of the Crystal Palace on the capital world of Zirion Prime, it featured walls made of pure harmonium that supposedly calmed any living creature, floors that adjusted their temperature to perfectly suit each occupant, and an atmosphere carefully balanced to promote growth and tranquility. The room hummed with the gentle energy of a dozen different healing technologies, from vegan bioresonators to Andromedan emotion stabilizers. Instead, it sounded like the end of the universe. Highkeeper Veltar pressed his six-fingered hands against his elongated skull as another wave of psychic distress crashed through the nursery. The baby astral dragons, all 7 of them, were in full tantrum mode, and, when infant creatures capable of manipulating spacetime through fits, reality itself began to crack. A small tear opened in the air above the central incubation chamber, revealing a glimpse of swirling void before snapping shut. One of the floating care pods suddenly, aged 50 years in 3 seconds, its pristine surface becoming pitted and worn. In the corner, a junior attendant's uniform temporarily turned into what appeared to be crystallized time, forcing him to stand perfectly still until the effect wore off. Status report, Veltar demanded through gritted teeth, his translator implant working overtime to convert his native Zephyrian clicks and whistles into galactic standard. Junior Keeper Nixera consulted her floating datapad with shaking hands. The same as yesterday, High Keeper, and the day before. All 7 hatchlings are rejecting every form of care we provide. They won't accept nutrition from any of our feeding systems, they cry constantly, and their psychic emissions are becoming increasingly dangerous. The palace's reality stabilizers are operating at maximum capacity just to keep the nursery from collapsing into another dimension. Veltar's large, compound eyes shifted through several color spectrums as he processed this information. As a member of the highly logical Zirian species, he found the situation completely incomprehensible. Everything in the nursery had been designed according to the best scientific principles in the galaxy. The temperature was optimal, the air was pure, the feeding systems delivered perfectly balanced nutrition, and the care protocols had been developed by studying every known child-rearing species in the Empire. So why were the Emperor's baby dragons dying? The astral dragons were the rarest creatures in known space, born only when 3 specific nebulae aligned in perfect harmony, an event that occurred roughly once every 1,000 standard years. The last batch of eggs had been discovered floating in the cosmic winds near the Helix Nebula, already partially incubated by stellar radiation and cosmic forces beyond normal understanding. When they hatched 3 weeks ago, the entire Empire had celebrated. These weren't just beautiful creatures, they were living symbols of imperial power, capable of growing into beings that could travel instantly between star systems and manipulate the very fabric of space. More importantly, they were the Emperor's personal pets, and the Emperor was not known for his patience with failure. Have the crystalline healers provided any new insights? Veltar asked, though he already suspected the answer. They completed their analysis this morning, Nixera replied, her tone growing even more worried. Master Healer Quintera says the hatchlings appear to be suffering from a form of distress that doesn't match any known biological or psychic condition. They're physically healthy, but something is causing them severe emotional trauma that we can't identify or treat. Another shriek echoed through the nursery, this one so powerful that several of the monitoring devices temporarily displayed readings from parallel dimensions. Veltar winced and activated the emergency psychic dampeners, creating a brief moment of relative quiet. In that quiet, he could hear something that made his blood freeze. The sound was getting weaker. When the baby dragons had first arrived, their cries had been powerful enough to shake the entire palace. Now, 3 weeks later, their voices were becoming thin and reedy. They were giving up, and when astral dragons gave up, they didn't just die, they took pieces of reality with them. "What about the mind weavers?" he asked desperately. "They've tried everything, High Keeper. Direct telepathic contact, emotional field manipulation, even attempting to share memories of peaceful experiences. The hatchlings' minds are too chaotic and primitive for their techniques to work." Master Vixlen compared it to trying to perform delicate surgery during an earthquake. Veltar walked over to the central viewing chamber, where the 7 baby dragons huddled together in a pathetic heap. Each one was about the size of his torso, covered in scales that shifted through colors that didn't have names in any known language. Their wings were still too small for flight, translucent membranes that occasionally sparkled with tiny stars. Under normal circumstances, they should have been adorable. Instead, they looked miserable. Their large, multifaceted eyes were dull with exhaustion, their normally vibrant scales had faded to muddy browns and grays, and they barely had the energy to lift their heads when he approached. "The Beast Whisperers?" he asked, though he already knew this answer too. "Complete failure. They said the dragon's emotional patterns are unlike anything they've encountered. Master Throndar actually apologized to the Emperor personally and offered to return his fee. That was particularly alarming. The Beast Whisperers of the Outer Rim were legendary for their ability to communicate with any living creature, no matter how alien or aggressive. If they had given up, the situation was truly hopeless. Veltar was about to ask about the backup care protocols when his communication implant chimed with an incoming priority message. The holographic seal that appeared in front of him made his stomach drop. It was the personal emblem of Emperor Zarthal himself. "High Keeper Veltar," the Emperor's voice boomed through the nursery, causing several pieces of equipment to vibrate sympathetically. "Report to my private chambers immediately. And bring solutions, not excuses." The communication cut off, leaving Veltar staring at empty air. In the background, the baby dragons had started crying again, their voices barely above whispers now. 20 minutes later, Veltar found himself in the Emperor's private study, a vast chamber carved from a single piece of living crystal that grew new rooms and passages according to the occupant's mood. Today, the walls were a deep, angry red, and the ceiling had formed itself into sharp, threatening spikes. Emperor Zarthal was not in a good mood. The Emperor was an imposing figure even by Zephyrian standards, standing nearly 3 meters tall with scales that shimmered like liquid metal and eyes that held the wisdom of 15 centuries. He had ruled the Empire for longer than most species had possessed spaceflight, and his patience had been worn thin by decades of galactic politics, rebellious systems, and, now, apparently, baby dragons. "Explain to me," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the crystal walls resonate, "how the greatest minds in my empire cannot manage to care for 7 small creatures." Veltar had prepared for this question, but actually answering it felt like trying to explain why water was wet. "Your Majesty, we have consulted with every available expert in childcare, animal psychology, and xenobiology. The dragons appear to be suffering from a form of distress that doesn't respond to any known treatment methods. They're rejecting all forms of nutrition, they won't sleep, and their constant crying is beginning to destabilize local spacetime." "I am aware of the spacetime issues," the Emperor replied dryly. "This morning, my breakfast temporarily aged backward into its constituent ingredients. Yesterday, the royal gardens experienced 3 different seasons simultaneously. The day before that, my personal shuttle ended up in orbit around a moon that doesn't exist yet." Veltar tried not to wince. When the Emperor was personally affected by a problem, that problem had a tendency to become everyone else's immediate crisis. "What I want to know," the Emperor continued, "is why creatures that should be thriving under the best care in the galaxy are instead dying slowly and taking my palace with them. Perhaps, Your Majesty, the issue is that we don't understand their basic needs. Astral dragons are extremely rare, and our knowledge of their early development is mostly theoretical. It's possible that something fundamental is missing from our care protocols. The Emperor's eyes flashed through several dangerous colors.
Are you suggesting that the finest caregivers in the Empire are inadequate for the task?
Not inadequate, Your Majesty, but, perhaps, too advanced. Sometimes the most sophisticated solutions aren't appropriate for the most basic problems.
This was clearly the wrong thing to say.
The Emperor's scales began to glow with an inner fire, and the crystal walls responded by growing longer, sharper spikes. High Keeper Veltar, you have served in this position for 47 years. You have successfully managed the care of exotic creatures from across the galaxy. You have overseen the hatching of phoenix birds, the raising of quantum wolves, and the feeding of creatures that exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously.
Are you truly telling me that 7 baby dragons are beyond your abilities?
Veltar felt his career prospects dimming by the second.
Your Majesty, we have exhausted every conventional approach.
Perhaps it is time to consider unconventional solutions.
Such as?
This was the moment Veltar had been dreading. The idea had been suggested by Junior Keeper Nixera during their morning briefing, and he had dismissed it as desperate nonsense. Now, with his Emperor's glowing eyes fixed on him and reality beginning to warp around the edges of the room, it was starting to sound less nonsensical and more like their only option. There are species in the galaxy known for their expertise in caring for difficult offspring. Species that have developed specialized techniques through necessity rather than technology.
Which species? The Emperor demanded.
Veltar took what might be his last breath as a free citizen.
Humans, Your Majesty.
The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to suck sound out of the surrounding space. Even the ambient hum of the palace's systems seemed to pause.
Humans, the Emperor repeated slowly. The primitive species from the Outer Rim? The ones who still use chemical propulsion for space travel? The ones who haven't even mastered basic energy manipulation?
Yes, Your Majesty. But they have one skill that may be relevant: they are extraordinarily successful at keeping their own offspring alive despite having no natural advantages for child-rearing. Their young are born completely helpless and require constant care for years, yet their survival rate is remarkably high. Some xenobiologists believe they have developed intuitive caregiving techniques that work across species boundaries. The Emperor stared at him for a long moment, and Veltar was fairly sure he could feel his job evaporating. Then, to his complete surprise, the Emperor began to laugh.
It wasn't a pleasant laugh.
It was the kind of laugh that preceded either promotions or executions, and rarely anything in between.
Humans, the Emperor said again.
You want me to entrust the care of the rarest creatures in the galaxy to a species that still believes in things like luck and intuition? Beings so primitive that they named their planets after mythological concepts. Your Majesty, with respect, conventional wisdom has failed us completely. The dragons are dying despite receiving the best care we can provide. Perhaps what they need isn't the best care, but the right care. The Emperor's laughter stopped abruptly.
And you believe these humans can provide the right care?
I believe, Your Majesty, that we have no other options. If we continue on our current path, the dragons will be dead within days, and the psychic backlash could damage the palace permanently.
Another long silence filled the room.
Veltar could hear the distant sound of the baby dragons crying, their voices now so weak that they barely registered on the psychic sensors.
Finally, the Emperor spoke. Very well. Contact the humans.
But, understand this, High Keeper, if this fails, if these primitive beings damage even one scale on my dragons, you will personally explain to me why I should not have you fed to a star.
Yes, Your Majesty. And, High Keeper? They have 72 hours.
After that, I will solve this problem myself, and my solutions tend to be permanent. Veltar bowed deeply and backed out of the room, his mind already racing with the logistics of contacting a species that most of the Empire still considered to be barely above the level of intelligent bacteria. As he walked back to the nursery, he could only hope that somewhere in that distant, primitive solar system, there was a human who knew something about crying babies. Because if there wasn't, his career was about to become a very short conversation with a very hungry star. Sarah Chen had been working double shifts at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for 3 weeks straight, and she was running on nothing but caffeine, determination, and the kind of stubborn professionalism that kept pediatric nurses functioning when everything else failed. She'd just finished helping deliver twins whose mother had been in labor for 18 hours, supervised the care of a premature baby who weighed less than a bag of sugar, and somehow managed to calm down a toddler who had been screaming for 40 minutes straight after getting his first vaccination.
It was just another Tuesday.
She was filling out paperwork in the break room, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her scrubs decorated with cheerful cartoon animals that had seen better days, when Dr. Martinez stuck his head through the door.
"Sarah, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent."
She looked up from her charts, noting the confused expression on her colleague's face.
"A patient's family?" "No, that's the weird part. He says he's from, well, you're probably going to want to talk to him yourself. He's in conference room B."
Sarah frowned but nodded, setting down her pen and following Dr. Martinez down the hallway. In her 12 years as a pediatric nurse, she'd dealt with everything from overprotective parents to social workers to the occasional journalist looking for a human interest story. She was prepared for pretty much anything the world could throw at her. She was not prepared for the 7-foot-tall alien in conference room B. The being standing next to the table was unlike anything she'd ever seen, even in movies. Its skin had a bluish, crystalline quality that seemed to shift and shimmer in the fluorescent lights, and its face was an elegant combination of features that were almost human but not quite. It had large, multifaceted eyes that reminded her of an insect's, but somehow conveyed intelligence and emotion in a way that was startlingly familiar. It was wearing what appeared to be a formal uniform made of materials that didn't exist in any Earth catalog. "Nurse Sarah Chen," the being asked in perfectly accented English, though something about the way it spoke suggested the words weren't coming naturally. Sarah stared for a moment, then did what she always did when confronted with something completely outside her experience. She fell back on professional politeness. "Yes, I'm Sarah Chen. And you are?" "I am Ambassador Kexhai of the Zephyrian Empire." "I apologize for the abrupt nature of this contact, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention, and our research indicates that you may be uniquely qualified to help."
Sarah blinked. "I'm sorry, did you say Zephyrian Empire?" "Yes. We represent a coalition of several hundred species spread across this section of the galaxy.
Until today, your species was unaware of our existence, and we believed yours to be too primitive for meaningful contact." "Okay," Sarah said slowly, deciding to process the implications of this statement later.
"What changed?"
"We have 7 baby dragons that are dying, and every expert in the Empire has failed to help them. After consulting our xenobiological databases, we determined that humans have the highest success rate in the galaxy for keeping difficult offspring alive.
We need your help." Sarah sat down heavily in one of the conference room chairs.
In all her years of nursing, she'd been asked to handle a lot of challenging situations, but this was definitely a first.
"Baby dragons," she repeated.
"Astral dragons, to be specific. They are extremely rare creatures capable of manipulating space and time. They're also approximately 3 weeks old, constantly distressed, refusing to eat, and their emotional state is beginning to cause structural damage to our Emperor's palace."
"And you want me to babysit them?" "We want you to save their lives.
And, potentially, prevent a diplomatic crisis that could result in the sterilization of your solar system."
Sarah stared at the alien ambassador for a long moment.
She'd dealt with plenty of life or death situations in her career, but usually the stakes were measured in individual lives, not entire solar systems.
"Assuming I believe any of this," she said carefully, "why me specifically? There are thousands of pediatric nurses on Earth, many with more experience than I have." Ambassador Kexhai consulted what appeared to be a floating holographic display. "Our analysis identified several factors.
You have extensive experience with premature and high-risk infants, you have the highest success rate in your hospital for calming distressed children, and, most importantly, you have demonstrated the ability to improvise effective solutions under extreme pressure. Yesterday, you successfully treated a baby whose condition didn't appear in any medical textbook, using techniques you invented on the spot." Sarah remembered that case, a newborn with an extremely rare genetic condition that had left him unable to process standard infant formula. She'd spent 6 hours researching alternatives, consulting with specialists, and, finally, developing a feeding protocol that combined elements from treatments for 3 different conditions. It had worked, but only because she'd been willing to try something completely unconventional.
"How do you know about that?" she asked.
"We have been monitoring your planet for some time, though we generally avoided contact due to your species' tendency toward explosive reactions to new information.
However, our current crisis supersedes normal protocols."
Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling the beginning of what was going to be a legendary headache.
"Okay, let's say I believe you.
Let's say there really are baby space dragons somewhere that need help, and, for some reason, you think a nurse from Philadelphia is the answer to your problems.
What exactly are you asking me to do?
Come with us to the Imperial Palace on Zirion Prime, assess the situation, and provide whatever care the hatchlings need to survive and thrive.
And if I say no?
Then, the dragons die, the Emperor becomes extremely upset, and your planet gets marked as a potential threat to Imperial security.
The usual result is orbital bombardment followed by atmospheric sterilization.
Sarah stared at him.
Are you threatening my entire planet to get me to babysit your dragons? I am explaining the consequences of failure.
The Emperor does not handle disappointment well, and these dragons are extremely important to him personally.
How important?
Important enough that he has already had 17 officials fed to a star for failing to solve this problem. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She'd dealt with demanding patients and impossible families before, but never with stakes quite this high.
What happened to the dragons? What's wrong with them that your experts can't fix? That's what we're hoping you can determine.
They appeared to be healthy when they hatched, but they immediately began exhibiting signs of severe distress. They won't eat, they barely sleep, they cry constantly, and their emotional state is so chaotic that it's affecting local spacetime. Every form of care we've provided has been rejected.
What kind of care?
Optimal nutrition delivered through energy transfer, perfect environmental controls, constant monitoring, and the attention of the finest caregivers in the galaxy.
Sarah frowned. Energy transfer? Direct nutrient infusion into their cellular matrix. Much more efficient than primitive feeding methods. And environmental controls?
Perfect temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition, automatically adjusted to maintain optimal conditions at all times.
Constant monitoring?
Comprehensive biometric scanning, psychic field analysis, and real-time health assessment.
Sarah was beginning to see a pattern. Ambassador Kexai, can I ask you something? Do you have children? I do not.
My species reproduces through crystalline budding.
Our offspring are essentially miniature adults from the moment of emergence. And the other species caring for these dragons? Similar reproduction methods.
Most advanced species have moved beyond the primitive requirement for extended child-rearing. Sarah sat back in her chair, a suspicion forming in her mind.
What do the dragons look like?
Small, approximately 60 centimeters in length, covered in scales that shift color based on emotional state, with underdeveloped wings and large eyes. They huddle together constantly and make continuous vocalizations.
And they're 3 weeks old? Correct. So they're basically babies. Actual babies, not miniature adults. I suppose that is one way to describe them.
Sarah stood up, pacing to the window and looking out at the city beyond. In the distance, she could see the playground at the elementary school across the street, where children were running around, playing, laughing, being loud and messy and completely chaotic.
Ambassador, I think I know what's wrong with your dragons. You do?
They're lonely, scared, and overwhelmed. You've given them perfect care from a technical standpoint, but you've missed the most important thing babies need.
Which is love. Comfort.
The knowledge that someone cares about them as individuals, not just as valuable objects to be maintained. The ambassador's large eyes shifted through several different colors, which Sarah was beginning to interpret as confusion.
I do not understand. All their biological needs are being met. Babies aren't just biological systems. They're emotional beings.
They need touch, warmth, attention, and the feeling that they're safe and wanted. From what you've described, you've been treating them like expensive equipment instead of living creatures. But surely advanced technology can provide superior care to primitive biological instincts. Not when those primitive biological instincts are exactly what the babies are designed to respond to.
Sarah turned back to face the ambassador, making her decision.
She'd spent her entire career helping vulnerable children, and these dragons sounded like the most vulnerable children she'd ever encountered.
I'll come with you, she said. But I have conditions. Name them. First, I want a guarantee that no matter what happens, Earth is safe.
These babies aren't responsible for your political problems, and neither is my planet.
Agreed.
Second, I want complete authority over their care.
If your expert's methods aren't working, then I need the freedom to try different approaches without interference.
That may be difficult to arrange.
The Emperor has strong opinions about proper protocol.
Then, the Emperor can explain to me personally why his protocols are more important than keeping his dragons alive. The ambassador's eyes shifted to what Sarah was starting to think of as alarm colors.
You wish to speak directly with the Emperor?
If that's what it takes to do my job properly, yes.
I will convey your requirements to the High Keeper.
Good. Third, I want some basic supplies from Earth. If I'm going to care for babies, I need baby care supplies, not advanced alien technology.
What kind of supplies?
Blankets.
Soft toys. A rocking chair. Formula and bottles. Maybe some children's music. Simple things that have been helping human babies feel safe for thousands of years.
I do not understand how such primitive items could be superior to our advanced care systems.
That's okay. You don't have to understand them. You just have to let me use them.
The ambassador was quiet for a moment, consulting his holographic display.
The situation is critical.
Time is running short, and the alternatives are unpleasant.
I am authorized to agree to your conditions. Then, let's go save some baby dragons.
As they left the conference room, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the reflective surface of the door. She looked tired, slightly overwhelmed, and completely unprepared for what she was about to do. In other words, she looked exactly like every other nurse who'd ever been asked to save a life with nothing but experience, intuition, and the stubborn refusal to give up. The only difference was that this time, the lives she was trying to save could apparently bend space and time. She had a feeling this was going to be the most challenging case of her career. The journey to Zirian Prime took what Ambassador Kexhai assured her was only 6 hours, though Sarah had no way to verify this since the concept of faster-than-light travel made her head hurt. The Zephyrian transport ship was unlike anything she could have imagined, less like a vehicle and more like a living crystal that happened to be hollow inside. The walls shifted and flowed around them as they traveled, responding to some intelligence she couldn't understand. She spent most of the trip in what the ambassador called the comfort chamber, a space that had somehow configured itself to approximate a human living room, complete with a couch that was almost the right size and lighting that didn't make her eyes water. She'd managed to convince Dr. Martinez to let her take an emergency leave of absence, though she hadn't exactly explained where she was going. She'd also stopped by a Target store to pick up supplies, filling 3 large bags with items that had made the ambassador's eyes shift through what she was learning to recognize as confused colors. "Explain to me again why you require these pacifiers," he said, holding up one of the small silicone devices like it might explode. "Babies need to suck on things.
It's a comfort reflex.
If they can't nurse or take a bottle, a pacifier helps them feel safe and calm."
But the dragons are not human infants.
No, but they're still babies.
And babies across species share certain basic needs.
The specific solutions might be different, but the underlying requirements are usually similar. Kexhai consulted his data pad again, a habit Sarah was beginning to find familiar.
Our xenobiological experts did not mention sucking reflexes in their analysis. Did your xenobiological experts spend any time actually watching the dragons, or did they just run scans and tests?
They conducted comprehensive biometric analysis and psychic field surveys.
That's not what I asked.
I am not certain how much direct observation was involved. Sarah sighed and pulled another item from her shopping bags, a small, soft teddy bear wearing a hospital gown that said "Get well soon" in cheerful letters.
This is a comfort object.
Human babies often attach to soft toys or blankets. Having something familiar and safe to hold helps them cope with stress. The dragons have each other for physical comfort.
Yes, but sometimes babies need something that's just theirs.
Something that smells familiar and feels safe. It's about security and emotional regulation, not just physical warmth.
Kexhai's eyes shifted to deeper blue tones that Sarah was starting to interpret as thoughtfulness.
Your species has developed very sophisticated techniques for managing the emotional needs of offspring.
We've had to.
Human babies are born incredibly helpless compared to most animals. They can't walk, they can't feed themselves, they can't even hold their heads up. If we hadn't figured out how to keep them calm and content, our species would have gone extinct millions of years ago.
An interesting perspective.
Most advanced species view extended child-rearing as an evolutionary weakness to be overcome. Maybe, Sarah said, pulling out a small bottle warmer and checking to make sure it would work with the ship's power systems. But maybe learning to care for helpless babies taught us skills that your advanced species never had to develop.
The ambassador was quiet for a moment. What skills? Patience. The ability to understand needs without verbal communication. Problem solving under pressure when lives are at stake. The willingness to try unconventional solutions when conventional ones fail. She looked up at him. Sound familiar?
Before he could answer, the ship's communication system chimed with what sounded like crystalline bells. Kexhi's eyes immediately shifted to alarmed orange. We're receiving a priority transmission from the palace, he said, activating a holographic display.
Highkeeper Veltar is requesting immediate conference.
The hologram that appeared showed a tall, elegant alien with features similar to Kexhi's but more refined, wearing elaborate robes that seemed to be made of woven starlight.
He looked exhausted and extremely worried. Ambassador Kexhi, the Highkeeper said without preamble. What is your current status?
We are approaching Zirian Prime with the human specialist.
ETA approximately 30 minutes. Understood.
I need to brief both of you on recent developments. The situation has deteriorated significantly. Sarah felt her stomach drop.
How significantly?
The Highkeeper's attention turned to her, and she saw surprise flicker across his features. He'd clearly been expecting someone more imposing than a tired-looking nurse in scrubs and sneakers.
You are the human specialist?
I'm Sarah Chen, and, yes, I'm here to help with your baby dragons.
I see. Miss Chen, I must inform you that we have lost one of the hatchlings.
Sarah felt like she'd been punched.
Lost how?
The smallest of the 7 stopped responding this morning. We managed to revive him using emergency bioenergetic stimulation, but he remains in critical condition. The others have become increasingly agitated since his collapse, and their psychic emissions are now strong enough to affect the entire palace complex.
What kind of effects?
Time dilation in the East Wing, gravitational anomalies in the throne room, and several sections of the palace have begun existing in parallel dimensions simultaneously. The Emperor has ordered all non-essential personnel to evacuate to the outer courtyards.
Kexhi's skin had taken on a distinctly greenish hue. And the Emperor's mood? Apoplectic.
He has requested that if this human's methods fail, we should simply contain the hatchlings until they expire naturally, then deal with the psychic backlash as best we can.
Contain them how? Sarah asked, though she had a feeling she wasn't going to like the answer. Stasis fields.
They would be preserved but unconscious until their life forces eventually fade.
Sarah stared at the hologram. You want to put dying babies into magical comas instead of trying to save them? It would prevent further damage to the palace structure.
It would also guarantee that they die. Miss Chen, the Highkeeper said carefully, you must understand that these creatures are extremely valuable, but they cannot be allowed to destroy the seat of imperial power. If they cannot be calmed and cared for safely, then preservation is the only alternative.
No, Sarah said firmly. It's not.
I beg your pardon?
I said no.
I didn't come halfway across the galaxy to watch you put sick babies into comas.
We're going to figure out what they need and give it to them.
The Highkeeper's eyes shifted through several alarmed colors. Miss Chen, with all respect for your expertise, you may not understand the scope of the crisis we're facing. I understand that you have 7 scared, sick babies who need help, and, instead of focusing on helping them, you're worried about property damage.
I've worked in emergency pediatrics for 12 years, Highkeeper.
I've seen babies who were born weighing less than a pound survive and thrive. I've seen children recover from conditions that should have killed them. And I've seen what happens when people give up on them too early. But the palace can be repaired. Those babies can't be brought back from the dead.
The Highkeeper was quiet for a moment.
The Emperor will not be pleased if the palace suffers additional damage.
Then, we'd better fix the problem quickly. Kexhi leaned forward. Highkeeper, what is the condition of the surviving hatchlings? Weakening rapidly.
They've stopped moving except to huddle closer together.
Their vocalizations have become almost inaudible.
Master Healer Quintera estimates they have perhaps 6 to 8 hours before systemic failure begins.
Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with critical cases. We need to get there now. And I need you to have the nursery cleared of everything except the absolute essentials. Cleared?
All the monitoring equipment, the energy field generators, the automatic feeding systems, all of it.
If it's not directly keeping them alive right now, I want it gone. Miss Chen, those systems represent the finest care technology in the galaxy.
And they're not working. Sometimes the best technology is the wrong technology.
The Highkeeper looked like he was about to argue, but Kexhai interrupted. Highkeeper, we are out of conventional options. The humans' conditions should be met.
There was a long pause.
Very well.
I will have the nursery prepared according to your specifications. But, Miss Chen, I must warn you, if this approach fails, there will be no opportunity for alternative methods.
Understood. The transmission ended, leaving Sarah and Kexhai alone in the crystal chamber. The ambassador's skin had settled into a deep purple that Sarah was beginning to associate with worry. Are you certain about this approach? He asked.
Removing advanced care systems seems counterintuitive.
Sometimes counterintuitive is exactly what you need.
Sarah began checking through her supplies again, mentally reviewing everything she knew about caring for critically ill newborns.
Tell me about their environment right now. What does the nursery look like? State-of-the-art medical facility.
Sterile, perfectly controlled, optimal lighting and atmospheric conditions.
Sterile how?
Energy fields that eliminate all potentially harmful microorganisms and contaminants.
So completely isolated from any normal environmental stimuli.
Of course.
Exposure to uncontrolled elements could be dangerous. Sarah shook her head. Kexhai, where were these dragons born originally? In the cosmic winds near the Helix Nebula.
They were discovered floating in space, surrounded by stellar radiation and cosmic dust. So they were born in a chaotic, uncontrolled environment full of variable stimuli and unpredictable conditions. Yes, but surely a controlled environment is superior for adult creatures, maybe. But babies often need a certain amount of stimulation to develop properly. Complete sterility and perfect control can actually be harmful to developing nervous systems.
The ambassador stared at her. Are you suggesting that our optimal care environment is actually damaging to the hatchlings?
I'm suggesting that what's optimal for an adult isn't necessarily optimal for a baby. Human newborns do better with some controlled chaos of voices, movement, gentle variations in light and temperature. Total isolation and perfect control can actually increase stress levels. This contradicts everything we understand about proper care protocols.
Maybe that's the problem.
The ship's communication system chimed again, and this time the voice that came through spoke in what Sarah assumed was the Zephyrian language, a complex series of musical tones and crystalline chimes that somehow conveyed urgency and alarm.
We're approaching the palace, Kexhai translated. And the situation has become critical.
Through what appeared to be a transparent section of the ship's wall, Sarah could see their destination, a massive complex of interconnected crystal structures that floated in space above a planet that looked like it was made of living gemstones. The palace was beautiful beyond description, with towers that spiraled into impossible geometries and walls that seemed to capture and refract starlight into patterns too complex for human eyes to fully process.
It was also clearly in distress.
Several sections of the palace were flickering between different states of existence, some towers were aging and de-aging in visible cycles, and there were small tears in space around the edges where reality seemed to be coming apart.
That's what baby dragons can do when they're upset? Sarah asked.
That's what baby astral dragons can do when they're dying, Kexhai corrected. Sarah shouldered her bags of supplies and checked to make sure everything was secure. In a few minutes, she was going to be face to face with creatures unlike anything Earth had ever produced, trying to save their lives with nothing but her experience with human babies and a collection of items from Target. She'd had worse odds before.
All right, she said. Let's go meet some dragons.
The Imperial Nursery looked exactly like what Sarah had expected from an advanced alien civilization, sterile, intimidating, and completely wrong for babies. The room was enormous, with walls that seemed to be made of living light and a ceiling that displayed what appeared to be a real-time view of swirling galaxies. Every surface was smooth and perfect, glowing with a soft, even illumination that had no shadows. The air itself felt processed and artificial, like breathing inside a computer. Along the walls, dormant monitoring equipment hummed quietly, ready to analyze every possible biological function. And, in the center of this technological marvel, huddled together in a pathetic pile on what appeared to be a platform made of crystallized starlight, were 7 of the most miserable-looking creatures Sarah had ever seen. The baby astral dragons were about the size of house cats, covered in scales that should have been beautiful but were currently a dull, sickly gray. Their wings were translucent membranes that hung limply from their small bodies, and their large eyes that should have sparkled with cosmic intelligence, were dim and listless. They barely had the energy to lift their heads when the group entered the room. One of them, noticeably smaller than the others, lay motionless except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. "Oh, sweeties," Sarah whispered, and she was surprised by the emotion in her own voice. Highkeeper Veltar was waiting for them, along with several other officials whose elaborate robes and worried expressions suggested they were very important people having a very bad day. They all turned to look at Sarah as she entered, and she could feel their skepticism like a physical weight.
"This is the human specialist," one of them asked in what was clearly not a compliment.
"I am Sarah Chen," she said, setting down her bags and walking slowly toward the dragons.
"And you are?"
"Master Healer Quintera," the being replied stiffly. "I have been overseeing the medical care of these creatures since their arrival."
"How are they doing?"
"Poorly. As you can see, they are barely responsive. Their life signs are weakening steadily, and the smallest one suffered complete systemic shutdown this morning. We managed to stabilize him, but his condition remains critical." Sarah approached the platform carefully, noting how the dragons shifted slightly when they sensed her presence. Their heads turned toward her with what little energy they had, and she could see intelligence in their eyes along with fear, exhaustion, and something that looked heartbreakingly like hope. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the platform. "I would not recommend direct contact," Master Healer Quintera said quickly. "Their psychic emissions are unpredictable, and physical contact could trigger another destabilization event."
"How long since anyone has actually touched them?"
"Touched them?" The healer looked confused.
"Direct physical contact is unnecessary.
Our care protocols utilize energy field manipulation for all required interactions." Sarah stared at her.
"You mean no one has held them? Petted them? Given them any kind of physical comfort in 3 weeks?"
"Physical contact with patients is generally considered unsanitary and potentially harmful."
"They're babies," Sarah said, and she couldn't keep the incredulity out of her voice.
"Babies need to be touched. They need physical comfort and reassurance."
"These are not human babies, Ms. Chen.
They are alien creatures with unknown physiological requirements." "No, they're babies who happen to be alien."
"There's a difference." Without waiting for permission, Sarah climbed onto the platform and sat down cross-legged near the huddled dragons.
Several of the officials made alarmed noises, but she ignored them. "Hello, little ones," she said softly, extending her hand slowly so they could see and smell her.
"I'm Sarah. I'm here to help."
The largest of the dragons lifted its head slightly and made a sound that was barely above a whisper, a soft, musical tone that seemed to carry more meaning than words.
Sarah recognized it immediately.
She'd heard that same note in countless emergency rooms and NICUs, from human babies who were too sick and scared to cry properly but still needed to communicate their distress. "I know," she said gently, moving her hand a little closer. "I know you're scared and you feel awful. But we're going to figure out what you need, okay?"
The dragon stretched its neck forward just enough to touch her finger with its snout.
The contact was electric, literally. Sarah felt a small shock of energy that seemed to carry emotion, fear, loneliness, exhaustion, and, underneath it all, a desperate need for comfort. Behind her, she heard Master Healer Quintera gasp.
"Extraordinary. The psychic resonance patterns are stabilizing."
"That's because babies need emotional connection, not just medical care," Sarah said, gently stroking the dragon's head. Its scales were warm and surprisingly soft, and she could feel some of the tension leaving its small body. The other dragons began to stir, moving closer to her with more energy than they'd shown since she entered the room. The smallest one, the one who'd nearly died, managed to lift his head and make a soft chirping sound. "There we go," Sarah murmured, reaching out to touch another dragon.
"That's better, isn't it? How did you do that?" Highkeeper Veltar asked. "Our emotional field manipulators couldn't achieve that level of psychic stabilization."
"I listened to them," Sarah said simply. "And I responded like they were babies instead of problems to be solved."
She continued petting the dragons while mentally assessing their condition.
They were clearly malnourished and dehydrated, but, more than that, they were suffering from what she would have called failure to thrive in human infants, a condition that occurred when babies' emotional needs weren't met, causing them to stop eating and developing normally.
What have you been feeding them? She asked.
Optimal nutrition delivered through direct cellular infusion, Master Healer Quintera replied.
The most efficient method possible. Have they ever actually nursed or eaten normally? Nursed? The healer looked confused again. I am not familiar with this term. Sarah sighed. Fed from their mother. Drank milk.
Eaten with their mouths instead of having nutrition injected into their cells. That would be extremely inefficient and, potentially, unsanitary.
It would also be normal. How do adult dragons feed? They consume cosmic energy and stellar radiation. But these aren't adults. They're babies.
Their digestive systems probably aren't developed enough for energy feeding yet.
Our analysis indicated that direct infusion would be superior. Your analysis was wrong.
The blunt statement caused a ripple of shocked silence through the room. Sarah ignored it and opened one of her bags, pulling out a baby bottle and a can of infant formula.
What is that? High Keeper Veltar asked. Baby food.
Human baby food, but the basic principles should be similar. You cannot seriously intend to feed advanced alien creatures with primitive human nutritional substances. I intend to feed hungry babies with something they can actually digest and absorb normally. Sarah began preparing the formula, warming it to body temperature and testing it on her wrist the way she'd done thousands of times before.
Do you have any idea what their natural mother's milk would be like?
Astral dragons do not produce milk. The young typically absorb nutrients from cosmic radiation while still in their shells.
But these were born in space, right? Away from their mothers?
Yes, they were discovered floating alone near the nebula. So they never got the nutrition they were supposed to get during their final development phase. They were born premature and malnourished, and you've been trying to force-feed them concentrated energy instead of giving them something they can actually process. Sarah held up the prepared bottle and approached the largest dragon. It lifted its head, clearly interested in the smell.
Let's try this, sweetie, she said, gently offering the bottle's nipple.
The dragon sniffed it cautiously, then opened its mouth and began to suck. The relief on its small face was immediate and obvious, and Sarah felt a surge of triumph. It's working, High Keeper Veltar said in amazement.
The biometric readings are improving dramatically.
The other dragons had noticed what was happening and were beginning to make soft, urgent sounds. Sarah pulled out more bottles from her bag. She'd brought a dozen, just in case.
Can someone help me feed them? She asked. They're all hungry.
I'll help, said a voice from the doorway.
Everyone turned to see a figure that made the other aliens look small and ordinary.
Emperor Zarthal stood in the entrance to the nursery, his massive frame barely fitting through the doorway, his metallic scales reflecting the rune's light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. His presence seemed to fill the space, making the air itself feel heavier.
Sarah felt her mouth go dry.
She'd been so focused on the dragons that she'd forgotten about the being who could destroy her entire planet if he was displeased.
Your Majesty, High Keeper Veltar said, bowing deeply. The human specialist has achieved some preliminary success.
I can see that, the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the walls vibrate slightly. The psychic disturbances have decreased significantly. He walked over to the platform, and Sarah realized that up close, he was even more imposing than she'd thought. His eyes held the wisdom and patience of centuries, but also a power that could remake reality if necessary.
You are Sarah Chen, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Your Majesty. You believe you can save my dragons. I believe they can be saved, yes.
But they need more than just medical care. They need proper food, emotional comfort, and, most importantly, they need to be treated like babies, not like valuable objects. The Emperor studied her for a moment, then picked up one of the prepared bottles.
Show me what to do.
For the next hour, Sarah found herself giving baby care instructions to the ruler of a galactic empire. The Emperor turned out to be surprisingly gentle for someone who could destroy solar systems, carefully supporting the small dragons and making soft, encouraging sounds as they fed. The other officials gradually joined in, and soon the nursery was filled with the sight of some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy bottle-feeding baby dragons. The change in the dragons was remarkable. Their scales began to brighten and shift through subtle color variations, their eyes became clearer and more alert, and, most importantly, they began to make contented, purring sounds instead of distressed cries. "They're still going to need ongoing care," Sarah said as she burped a dragon that was roughly the size of a kitten but considerably heavier. "Regular feeding, emotional support, and gradual introduction to their natural diet as they develop. You will remain to oversee their care," the Emperor said. "I can stay for a while, but eventually I'll need to return to Earth.
My hospital needs me. Your hospital can manage without you. These dragons cannot."
Sarah looked up at him, noting the complete certainty in his voice. "Your Majesty, with respect, I can't abandon my life and career to become a permanent dragon nanny."
"You can if the alternative is the destruction of your planet. Are you threatening me again? I am explaining reality. These dragons are essential to the Empire's stability. You have demonstrated the ability to care for them successfully. Therefore, you will remain."
Sarah felt a familiar surge of irritation, the same feeling she got when dealing with demanding parents who thought their problems were more important than everyone else's. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "I understand that your dragons are important. But I have responsibilities on Earth, and other children who need my help.
I can't just disappear. Other children are not my concern. Well, they're mine."
The room fell silent. Sarah realized she just contradicted the ruler of a galactic empire to his face, which was probably not the smartest career move she'd ever made. The Emperor stared at her for a long moment, his eyes shifting through colors she couldn't interpret. Then, to her complete surprise, he began to laugh. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Sarah Chen."
"Probably both."
"Indeed." He was quiet for a moment, watching as the dragon in his arms fell asleep against his chest.
"Very well.
Remain here for 1 month to establish proper care protocols and train my staff. After that, you may return to Earth, but you will make yourself available for consultation as needed."
Sarah felt a wave of relief. That seems reasonable.
"And your planet will be granted protection status within the Empire. No hostile actions, full diplomatic recognition, and access to selected Imperial technologies."
Thank you." "Do not thank me yet.
You still have to keep these dragons alive for the next month. If you fail, our agreement becomes void." As if in response to his words, the smallest dragon, the one who'd nearly died that morning, lifted his head and made a soft, musical sound that Sarah chose to interpret as optimistic. "I think we'll be fine," she said.
"But I'm going to need some things from Earth."
"Such as?" "More formula, baby blankets, some children's music, and about 50 more bottles."
"Done."
As she sat in the nursery of an alien palace, feeding baby dragons while surrounded by beings who could reshape reality, Sarah reflected that this was definitely the strangest day of her nursing career. But the dragons were alive, they were feeding, and they were finally content. For a pediatric nurse, that was really all that mattered. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival at the Imperial Palace, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The nursery, once a sterile technological showcase, had been converted into something that looked suspiciously like the pediatric ward back home. Soft blankets covered the crystal platforms, colorful toys were scattered around the room, and the gentle sound of Earth lullabies played from speakers that Ambassador Kexhai had somehow managed to integrate with Zephyrian technology.
The baby dragons had thrived under Sarah's care.
They were now twice their original size, their scales shimmered with healthy iridescence that shifted through rainbow patterns, and their wings had developed enough for short, supervised flights around the nursery.
Most importantly, they had personalities.
"No, Cosmos, you cannot have another bottle right now," Sarah said firmly to the largest dragon, who had learned that making pitiful chirping sounds usually resulted in extra feeding.
"You just ate 20 minutes ago."
Cosmos, she'd started naming them after her second day, despite protests from several officials, fluffed his wings indignantly and turned to Emperor Zarthal with an expression that Sarah swore was manipulative. The Emperor, who had taken to visiting the nursery every morning, was surprisingly susceptible to dragon charm. "Perhaps one small additional feeding would not be harmful," he suggested, his voice carrying the same tone Sarah had heard from countless grandparents trying to sneak extra cookies to their grandchildren. "Your Majesty, overfeeding leads to digestive issues and behavioral problems."
"Cosmos is perfectly healthy and just being demanding. I am the ruler of a galactic empire. Surely I can authorize additional nutrition for my dragons."
You're also being played by a 3-month-old dragon who's figured out that you're a soft touch. The Emperor's eyes shifted to what Sarah had learned was mild embarrassment. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd developed an ability to read Zephyrian emotional displays that surprised everyone, including herself. I merely wish to ensure their optimal development.
They're developing optimally.
Look. Sarah gestured to where the other 6 dragons were engaged in what could only be described as play. Nebula and Stardust were chasing each other in lazy circles around the room, their wings creating small sparkles of light as they flew. Galaxy and Quasar were wrestling gently over a stuffed elephant that Sarah had brought from Earth, making soft growling sounds that were probably supposed to be threatening but mostly sounded adorable. Aurora was practicing landing on various perches, while Little Comet, the smallest one who'd nearly died, was determinedly trying to figure out how to open a toy box with his tiny claws. Their motor development is accelerating rapidly, Master Healer Quintera reported, consulting her datapad. Their psychic abilities are manifesting ahead of schedule, but in controlled, age-appropriate ways. Most importantly, their emotional stability has improved by over 300%. That's because they're happy, Sarah said, watching as Aurora successfully performed a perfect loop-de-loop and chirped with pride. Happy babies develop faster than stressed babies. Highkeeper Veltar nodded thoughtfully. He'd become one of Sarah's strongest supporters after watching her work, though he still occasionally looked confused by her methods.
The contrast with their initial condition is remarkable.
I confess, I underestimated the importance of emotional well-being in childcare.
Most people do, Sarah said.
Especially when dealing with difficult situations. It's easy to focus on the technical problems and miss the simple solutions. Speaking of which, the Emperor said, I have received reports that several other Imperial nurseries are requesting consultation on child-rearing difficulties. It appears that proper emotional care may be a neglected aspect of our child development programs.
Sarah felt a familiar mix of pride and exhaustion.
Over the past 3 weeks, word had spread through the Imperial Court about the human who'd solved the unsolvable dragon crisis. She'd been asked to advise on everything from crystalline younglings who wouldn't stop glowing to quantum wolf pups who kept teleporting into solid objects.
That's wonderful, she said. But, remember, I can't solve every problem. Sometimes you just need to pay attention to what the children are telling you. Indeed. Which brings me to an important matter.
The Emperor's tone became more formal, which usually meant he was about to make a pronouncement that would affect thousands of people. The Imperial Council has voted to establish a new department, Interspecies Child Development, with a focus on emotional well-being protocols. You would, naturally, be invited to head this department.
Sarah had been expecting this conversation.
Over the past week, various officials had dropped hints about permanent positions, extended stays, and the tremendous honor of serving the Empire. She'd been dreading having to give her answer.
Your Majesty, I'm honored by the offer, but my answer is still no.
The position would come with considerable authority, unlimited resources, and the opportunity to revolutionize childcare across hundreds of species. And it would require me to leave my home, my family, and my patients on Earth. Your planet would benefit greatly from close association with the Empire. Advanced medical technology, extended lifespans, access to resources that could eliminate poverty and disease. Sarah picked up Comet, who had managed to open the toy box and was now trying to climb inside it. Your Majesty, I appreciate everything you're offering, but I can't abandon my responsibilities for personal advancement, no matter how attractive it is.
Even if your refusal means that other children across the galaxy will not receive optimal care? It was a low blow, and they both knew it. Sarah had spent 3 weeks watching Imperial childcare specialists struggle with basic concepts like comfort and emotional security. She could make a real difference here, potentially helping millions of young creatures across hundreds of worlds. But she'd also spent 12 years building a career and relationships on Earth, working with children who needed her just as much as these dragons had. I've been thinking about that, she said carefully. What if there was another way?
Such as? I spend 3 months here, 4 times a year. That's enough time to train your staff, establish protocols, and handle crisis situations. The rest of the time, I work on Earth, but I'm available for consultation via your communication systems.
The Emperor considered this for a moment. The logistics would be complex. But not impossible. And it would give you access to ongoing human expertise while allowing me to maintain my life and career on Earth. There would also be the question of compensation. I'm not interested in payment. But there is something I'd like in return. Name it. A cultural exchange program. Send some of your medical specialists to Earth to learn about human child care techniques. In return, Earth medical professionals could come here to learn about advanced xenobiology. Share knowledge instead of just giving orders. Highkeeper Veltar's eyes brightened. An intriguing proposal. Cross-species learning could benefit both civilizations significantly. And, Sarah added, establish a small Earth embassy here at the palace. Nothing major, just a permanent presence so our species can start building a real relationship instead of just an emergency consultation service. The Emperor was quiet for several minutes, watching as the dragons played around the nursery. Cosmos had given up trying to manipulate extra food and was now attempting to teach Nebula how to hover in place. Galaxy had successfully claimed the stuffed elephant and was proudly showing it to anyone who would pay attention. Very well, he said finally. The terms are acceptable. But I have one additional requirement. Which is? You will train at least 50 Imperial specialists in your methods before the end of your first rotation. I want these techniques disseminated throughout the Empire as quickly as possible. Agreed. And, Sarah? Yes? You will return in 6 months for your first extended rotation. The dragons will miss you. As if summoned by his words, all 7 dragons suddenly converged on Sarah, climbing over each other to get close to her. Comet perched on her shoulder, Aurora settled in her lap, and the others arranged themselves around her feet, making contented purring sounds. I'll miss them too, she admitted. 2 days later, Sarah stood in the palace's transport bay, preparing to return to Earth. Her bags were packed with gifts from grateful Imperial officials, data chips containing medical information that would revolutionize human understanding of biology, and a communication device that would allow her to stay in touch with the dragons. The dragons themselves were gathered around her, making increasingly pitiful sounds as they sensed her impending departure. Comet had attached himself to her leg and refused to let go, while Cosmos kept trying to hide her luggage. They'll be fine, she assured Highkeeper Veltar, who was overseeing their care during her absence. You have all the protocols, you know their individual personalities, and, most importantly, you understand now that they need emotional care along with medical care. I confess, I am nervous about managing them without your guidance. You'll do great. And, remember, babies are more resilient than they seem. They just need to know that someone cares about them. Emperor Zarthal approached, carrying an official-looking document case. The formal agreements for our exchange program, he said. Along with a few additional items. Such as? Full diplomatic immunity for Earth, protection status that extends to your entire solar system, and a small gift. What kind of gift? The technology for faster-than-light communication. No more 6-hour journeys for consultation calls. Sarah stared at him. You're giving humanity FTL communication technology? It seems practical. How else would you properly supervise dragon care from halfway across the galaxy? Before Sarah could respond, Ambassador Kexhai appeared with a final passenger for the return journey, a tall, elegant Zephyrian wearing medical robes. This is Dr. Rindara, he said. She has volunteered to be our first exchange student. She will observe human child care techniques at your hospital and report back to the Imperial Medical Council. Dr. Rindara bowed formally. I am honored to learn from the human specialist who saved the Emperor's dragons. Just Sarah, she said, returning the bow. And I look forward to showing you around Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Fair warning, though, it's going to be a lot more chaotic than this palace. I believe I am prepared for chaos, Dr. Rindara replied. After watching you work, I have come to understand that chaos and healing often go together. As the transport ship prepared for departure, Sarah took one last look at the nursery through the viewing port. The dragons were playing happily under Veltar's watchful supervision, their scales bright with health and contentment. They'd grown from dying, desperate babies into thriving young creatures who would someday become some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. And it had all started because someone had finally thought to treat them like babies instead of problems to be solved. 6 months later, Sarah returned to Zirian Prime to find the Imperial Nursery transformed into something resembling a cross between a children's hospital and a daycare center. The dragons, now the size of large cats and capable of short-range teleportation, greeted her with enthusiastic aerial acrobatics and what sounded suspiciously like attempts at human speech.
More importantly, she found nurseries throughout the empire being redesigned according to her protocols, imperial medical students taking courses in emotional childcare, and a waiting list of species requesting consultation on their own child-rearing challenges. The Galactic Empire had discovered something that humans had known for millennia: sometimes the most advanced solution was also the most basic one. And, sometimes, the most important technology was a gentle touch, a soft voice, and the understanding that every baby, human, dragon, or otherwise, needed to know that someone cared about them enough to figure out what they really needed. 3 years later, when the first human children visited Zirion Prime as part of the cultural exchange program, they were delighted to discover that the palace's most popular attraction was a nursery full of young dragons who had learned to play games, follow simple commands, and, yes, occasionally manipulate their caregivers for extra snacks. But that was just part of growing up, whether you were human or dragon. And, throughout the galaxy, in nurseries and hospitals on hundreds of worlds, alien children were benefiting from techniques developed in the emergency rooms and pediatric wards of Earth, techniques based on the simple understanding that caring for children was about more than keeping them alive. It was about helping them thrive. Sarah Chen, meanwhile, had become something unique in galactic history, the first human to receive the Imperial Medal of Honor for services to interspecies child development. She kept it on her desk at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, right next to a picture of 7 baby dragons and a note that read, in shimmering Zephyrian script, "Thank you for showing us how to love." Because sometimes, that's all it takes to change the galaxy.